So, hi everybody, welcome back to Law Hero. My name is Jen and I'm a videos about the law. And today we're actually talking about emotional intelligence because it is extremely important not only to have in the workplace, in your relationships, but just to have a more pleasurable life for yourself. When we talk about emotional intelligence, obviously there's been a big debate about the role emotional intelligence plays as against intellectual intelligence. And a lot of people have cited that having emotional intelligence is actually more important than having intellectual intelligence. So, the areas of emotional intelligence that we're going to look at today are self awareness, self management, social awareness, and relationship management. Having awareness of the self. Self management is all around having, balance, being adaptable, being able to change and maneuver in any given situation. Social awareness is basically having empathy. And then relationship management is around influencing people, teamwork, being inspiring, conflict management, and I said influence. So, I read this book on emotional intelligence, and the very first chapter is around becoming angry because anybody can become angry, and this is what Aristotle called a challenge. So it is a challenge because it is very easy to become angry, and the problem is, it's like you are in the moment, you are saying things, you're feeling things, and it feels kind of satisfying to let loose in the moment. But obviously, after you've had the argument or after you've got angry, like a boss who gets angry with their subordinates, you always feel some sort of regret because you've lost control. And so Aristotle said to be angry with the right person to the right degree at the right time for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not easy. So those who are at the mercy of impulse and who lack self-control, they actually suffer a moral deficiency because their ability to control their impulse is actually a reflection of your character. And if you are of strong character, you will have an ability to control your emotions. So your emotions determine your temperament. And that is why people who have emotional control, they're far more trusted, they're far more influential because people know they're not going to fly off the handle at any little thing. But I have some good news for you. If you do fly off the handle and if you do get angry easily, I'm here to tell you that the brain is malleable and that your temperament is not your destiny. You can learn to change it. And that is because all emotions are impulses to act. And it's like your body is giving you a blueprint on how to handle life that is instilled within you. And I've said in other videos that like your emotion comes from a reaction. The reaction is to a memory that's stored in your nervous system and that could be housed there for years, and that's called a trigger. So emotion means to move away, which means the tendency to act, and it's implicit in every emotion. So like emotion means something you feel internally that moves you. And obviously, if you're triggered in a good or a bad way, you're going to move, you're going to like feel some change inside of you that causes you either to act or not act. But whether you control your emotions is a skill. So we all have two minds. We have an emotional mind and a kind of rational mind. And some people call this your head and your heart. Your rational mind is your head and your emotional mind is your heart. However, the emotional brain was there long before there was a rational one. And we know this because of hunter-gatherers and how they interacted in their tribes. And as I said, emotions are housed in the limbic system. And this is where neurons that were added to the brain and that came with emotion. So the limbic system consists of learning and memory. As I said, memories are housed in your limbic system, and these can either help or hinder you depending on your level of emotional awareness. So do you know your triggers? Do you know what stresses you? Do you know what makes you happy? And this comes back to Socrates, know thyself. Okay, so a lot of us will be aware of the concept of emotional hijacking. And there's a really good phrase which I heard, which is life is a comedy for those who think and a tragedy for those who feel. It's actually from Horace Walpole. And I really love that because what it does is the more you think about things, the more life becomes kind of more predictable and kind of less stressful. Whereas the more you're in your feelings and like you're constantly relying on like your sense of justice, like whether something is fair or unfair, and that's how you view situations, things are going to be much, much harder. And this is where the whole EQ and IQ thing comes in. So your amygdala is the part of the brain which stores your emotional memory. And when your amygdala gets hijacked emotionally, it becomes an impassioned action that we regret afterwards. And what it does is it creates the fight or flight response. And that is why, of course, we have this whole rise in mindfulness, because we want to be able to control our emotional reactions. It's essentially an out of date neural alarm. If you were sleeping at night as a hunter gatherer and some woolly mammoth came to try and eat you or whatever, you needed the amygdala to go into fight or flight. But nowadays, the amygdala can be triggered by anything, and that's, as a modern human being, what we're trying to control. The simple aspect of all of this is you never want your emotions to be fast and sloppy. So as I said, emotional hijacking is the amygdala is triggered and it's a failure to activate a process that keeps emotional balance and reduces emotional worrying. That's what it means to have an emotional hijacking. And that's why academic intelligence has very little to do with emotional life. You can be extremely intellectual person, but if you're not able to control emotional hijacking, for example, if you're like a pilot or somebody who's in some area that requires a lot of concentration and you go through an emotional hijacking, you could put a lot of people in danger. So essentially what emotional intelligence means is being able to motivate yourself, persist in the face of frustration, control your impulses, delayed gratification, regulate your mood, and keep distress from swamping the ability to think, empathize, and hope. And that is why people with high emotional intelligence, they are very hopeful people, they're very positive people, because they know that the process is more important than the outcome. And that's why when failures come or they're fearful, it's less likely to have an impact on them. And it'll also ultimately help you understand yourself and the motives of others. And that's why self-awareness is the keystone of emotional intelligence. The next thing then, of course, is managing the emotion, recognizing the emotion of others, and handling the relationships. And basically, all of that comes from knowing thyself. So how do you get to know yourself better? Well, one really popular way is to remain neutral and kind of watch yourself from like the third person while you're going through turbulent emotions. So being aware about your mood and kind of like knowing what thoughts you're having during the day. Do they drive you to certain behaviors? And I'll give you an example. So for me, and I'm sure a lot of people are like this, after work I would seek some comfort just because of how intense my thoughts were during the day. I was looking for something, quite banal, something very like, a way to tune out from the world. And for me, that was shopping, doing online shopping. And it's quite destructive, obviously, because then I was overspending. And what I had to actually do was realize that it was the emotion and like the tiredness and the fatigue of working was driving me to overspend. But when I made the connection, it was much easier to stop spending. But you have to be kind of non-judgmental about yourself and like understand that it's a flaw and that everybody has flaws, nobody's perfect, but like it is very, very useful to just be aware of your flaws, because then, if people say them to you, you won't be so surprised or taken aback, or you won't end up in these messes, because you'll be like, yeah, that's totally me, sometimes I overspend. And like that is self-maturity, being able to withstand emotional storms rather than being a passionate slave. And like that is a virtue ever since the time of the Greeks. So it's simply care and intelligence in conducting your life, a tempered balance and wisdom or temperance, which is restraining emotional excess. And that was called a sophronin. It's a Greek word, and that's what it ultimately means to be in control of your emotions. Now, at the same time, you don't want to become like a blank slate. You don't want to be somebody who's just so emotionless. You just become like cold and callous. It's very important, but it has to be appropriate to whatever situation you're in. And obviously, when emotions are muted, it creates distance. But when emotions are out of control, they create like pathology. So that's why managing your emotions is a full-time job, and realizing that everything we do is in a response to managing our mood. And as I said earlier, like when I would finish a day of work and go shopping, that was moving away from the pain of doing something that I found. And like work can be painful at times, but it's an important type of pain because it's for growth. It's what's called growing pains. But I was seeking that pleasure as an antithesis to what I was doing during the day. So, as I mentioned before, anger is a pretty difficult one to manage, but one of the key tips to managing anger is reframing a situation in a positive sense. And that is probably the best way to put anger to rest. So, for example, if someone cuts in on you when you're driving, one thing I always do, which I find really helpful, is you don't know what that person's going through right now. It requires a lot of empathy, but certainly it diffuses anger if there is any. That it's called reframing the situation, and it certainly does help. And the other difficult place people find managing emotions is around worrying and stress. So chronic repetitive worrying is low grade emotional hijacking. And like worrying in itself it depends on how heavy it is. I'm a worrier myself, but it's a low grade of anxiety disorder. The problem is what worry can become over time. So when worrying becomes about a feared situation, it becomes a phobia. When it becomes about preventing calamity, it becomes an obsession. And when it becomes about fear of dying or having some sort of, medical issue, it becomes a panic attack. And worrying is in the mind's ear, not in the mind's eye. So we have like cognitive and semantic worrying. And that means is that we think about, what the worrying thing is going to bring about. And then the other like side of it is like physiological, like what happens internally when you're going through fight or flight. And a lot of the time, the remedy is to focus on the effect of a relaxation technique. So, for example, breathing. Some people do they get some calming oils, and this is all types of sensual safety. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people worry because there is actually a payout to worrying. So, for example, what worrying does, it distracts you from the thing you're actually worried about. Like it's like a process that you go through. And what it does is it like gives the brain something to deal with, and it feels like you're almost being proactive about the thing you're afraid of, but ultimately it leads to phobias, obsessions, and panic attacks. So you want to nip it in the bud as quick as you can. Another really great way to deal with worry is distraction, and the best way is cardio, helping other people, and being grateful for what you have is actually cited as one of the ways to reduce worry. So we're nearly done. The thing you have to remember about worrying and anxiety and all of that is it completely undermines your intellect, physiologically and psychologically. So the number of worries you have is in direct proportion to how you will actually do. So what I'm trying to say is that worrying wastes time, and what that essentially does is when it comes to the anticipation of doing whatever you have to do, anticipatory anxiety, book the expectation effect essentially says you will succeed to the level of your expectations and also fail to the level of your expectations. So even if you have prepared well but are feeling very negative about the outcome, you may get through, but it'll be a struggle. Like optimism and hope are the antidotes to life's miseries, and they are the greatest motivators. So yeah, that is my 2 cents on emotional intelligence. I have read quite a few books on them, and I really do think that from learning about all these things, you become such a more valuable worker, a better asset to yourself in terms of, deep work. And yeah, I hope you like that, and I'll see you in the next one.